Thank you all for coming out on this very rainy day. My name is Mona Dove. I'm with the National Endowment for Democracy. The Endowment is a private, non-profit foundation dedicated to the growth and strengthening of democratic institutions around the world. I'm a program officer there on our Asia team. The Endowment does not take positions on U.S. government policy, and I will serve as the moderator for today's discussion. Thank you first to Representative Hultgren and Representative McGovern, the two co-chairs of the Tom Lantos Commission, and their staff members for their continued commitment and efforts to safeguarding human rights around the world, and for convening this important briefing today. This briefing is quite timely, as Bangladesh has a fast approaching election on December 30th. The election period has begun in what several analysts note is an increasingly authoritarian environment where the ruling party is using undemocratic measures to silence dissent and opposition party voices. Today, the European Parliament adopted a resolution expressing serious concern at the deteriorating human rights situation in Bangladesh, and in particular, the ongoing crackdown against the media, students, activists, and the political opposition. It's imperative for the future of Bangladesh's democracy that these elections, these parliamentary elections, be conducted in a free, fair, and credible manner that commands the legitimacy in the eyes of the public. The National Democratic Institute and other similar institutions have issued a series of recommendations to this end. In particular, they've called on the government to ensure that there is no interference with the work of the Election Commission, that the domestic and international election observers that are present and journalists are permitted to conduct their work unobstructed, that law enforcement officials be strictly neutral in their maintenance of law and order, and that opposition figures are permitted to campaign freely, and that there is an end to their prosecution and detention. Today we are joined by a great panel of three very close watchers of the situation in Bangladesh who will share their perspective on the current situation. First, we will hear from John Sifton, who is the Asia Advocacy Director at Human Rights Watch. Then from Waris Husein, a policy analyst at the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, and Laura Bramon, a senior program manager at World Vision's International Programs Group focused on child protection and education. I would also like to note the presence of Minister and Deputy Chief of Mission, Mehboob Hassan Saleh from the Bangladesh Embassy, and the U.S. former Ambassador Bernanke. With that, let me hand it over to John, if each of our speakers could keep their remarks to 5 to 7 minutes, and then I would love to open it up to the crowd.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me start by thanking members of the Tom Lantos Commission for inviting me to the briefing today. Our staff in Bangladesh and other colleagues of theirs who work on human rights issues in Bangladesh, to them it's very inspiring that thousands of miles away from Bangladesh, so many people can gather to hear about the situation there. Mona mentioned the European Parliament resolution that was passed this morning, which copies of which are right here. It's equally inspiring that in Brussels, thousands of miles from here, also all of this attention is being paid. It's very important to them knowing and fighting for human rights there that sort of attention is happening. And in that sense, this hearing is extraordinarily timely and important. So look, Bangladesh's political situation, let me be clear, is in crisis. But to best understand the country's current problems, a quick review of recent history is in order. So I'll just provide a very brief overview of how we got here. The ruling Awami, headed by Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, has been in power since 2009. And in the most recent election, Sheikh Hasina won a second term in January 2014, but this was only after the primary opposition parties boycotted the polls. The opposition had held protests before the elections, many of which were violent, demanding that elections be held under an impartial caretaker government. Hasina refused, leading to the boycott. With half the seats uncontested, the Awami League ran unopposed, and since then the country's essentially been a one-party state. National elections are now scheduled for December 30th of this year, and the government has again rejected opposition demands for a neutral caretaker government of sorts to be appointed. But this time, opposition parties have announced their participation and will run, although they are requesting international observers to ensure more free and fair polling. The government, unfortunately, is not agreeing to those terms. Now look, there's no reason to think that these elections are going to be conducted in a fully free and fair atmosphere right now. And over the last year, authorities have detained or jailed, in other respects, many senior opposition leaders. They've lodged politically motivated, trumped up legal cases against thousands of opposition supporters, and violated international standards on freedom of speech by cracking down on media and civil society who are critical of government abuses, even if they're not partisan or civil society. And human rights groups have remained under pressure due to restrictions on their funding. Journalists have reported threats and intimidation to prevent criticism of the government. But let me now provide some details of what I'm talking about more precisely. Before I do that, though, I just need to make clear, Human Rights Watch is not a partisan organization. You may hear me speaking of the opposition and the ruling party, but we take no position for or against any political party. And I think if you look on our records, if you look at our website, for instance, you'll see that Human Rights Watch was critical of human rights abuses by the Bangladeshi government, no matter who is in power. And if you consult the old pages, you will see that when the current opposition party was in power, we were critical of them as a ruling party. So Human Rights Watch has no political agenda for or against any political party. Our primary concern is with the human rights abuses that are being committed in the country. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about. So let me give a quick overview of the contours of the crackdown. First, as I'm sure almost everybody in this room knows, the leader of the primary opposition group, the Bangladesh National Party, Khalida Zia, is in jail. The government jailed her in February in connection with several long-standing corruption cases. Aside from the specific merits of those cases, opposition party supporters view Zia's prosecution as motivated politically, motivated by the political agenda of the Awami League. And what they point out is that the charges against her were brought by the military government that preceded Sheikh Hasina's rule, and that government had also brought charges against Sheikh Hasina. Those charges against Sheikh Hasina were dropped when she came to power. The charges against Zia proceeded. But look, the crackdown is about more than just Zia's detention. The government has, in other months since then, filed trumped-up charges against thousands of other opposition supporters, and the BNP, for its part, is claiming that they have documented at least 5,000 new arrests, including 1,000 that they provided information to the government. But beyond the arrests, I mean, the numbers of persons accused in court documents are so extensive that some media, have found people who are dead on the list of people who have been charged. I mean, there's just such a broad number of names that are being thrown out. It's a broad crackdown. It's really hard to tell how many people have been detained politically, but there is a little bit to be glimpsed in the overall population change in Bangladesh's jail population in recent months. There's been approximately 14,000 to 15,000 new prisoners since September. Some of those are just ordinary criminal cases, but with an increase of that size, it gives you a sense of how big this crackdown might be. And there's also been a lot of disappearances. I mean, we've documented at least 19 BNP supporters in recent years who have simply disappeared, and we don't even know whether they're detained in jails. And there may be additional cases, but the numbers are quite likely far higher. The word that many people use when describing this whole atmosphere in Bangladesh right now is fear. I hear things like hundreds of people have disappeared. We don't know where they are. Fear, suspicion, tension, threats, a culture of fear, an environment of fear. A newspaper editor said, as an editor, I should have to decide what to publish. I need to save my reporters from intimidation. So many people predict that when the election takes place, it will be, it'll be in fair atmospheres, and then it will be rigged to benefit the Awami League, and that violence will likely occur in the aftermath. So that's one of the serious problems that's facing us. We've seen a lot of violence by the security forces over the recent years. We wrote an entire report on our website about kneecapping, the phenomenon where security forces take opposition members into custody and then shoot them in the leg or in the kneecap, often leading to permanent disability. This has especially been used against youth members of the Jamaat party. So you can go on our website and read about that. But there's egregious and recent cases of brutality from this summer when student protests were broken up by both police and security forces, but also the youth wings of the and student wings of the Awami League Party. Very violent protests, which, by the way, led to the detention of a photojournalist and activist, Shahidul Alam, whose work documenting those protests and criticizing the government crackdown appears to have directly led to his arrest in August. He was granted bail this morning, but he remains in detention as of right now, as the government appeals that decision. So that's a continuing case of concern. In my written remarks, I also talk about something we can talk about in the Q&A, which is the Digital Security Act, which we see as a problematic law, has language that essentially allows the government to lock up whoever they want for critical statements. I also think we can talk in the Q&A about the Rohingya crisis and the effects that that's having on the way it fits into the political crisis. This morning, the government came very close to beginning a repatriation of a small number of Rohingya refugees, but an enormous international outcry appears to have led them to suspend that when they also simultaneously realized in Cox's Bazar that there were no Rohingya to be found who wanted to go back to Burma. So I can talk about that in the Q&A too. Last thing I want to say, just I know I'm over time, the recommendations, what we need to talk about, both here and in the Q&A afterwards, is what can the U.S. government do about this? The Trump administration doesn't have a great amount of credibility on human rights issues right now for various reasons that I won't go into. But Congress does have a role to play as 1/3 of the U.S. government. The United States Congress is part of the United States government, and they can flex their muscles in terms of communicating to the Bangladeshi government that it expects this crackdown to be eased and for free and fair elections to happen, and that there are many pieces of leverage from military to military ties and assistance to tariff issues and things that are negotiated by the U.S. Trade Representative, but also hard sanctions. Members of the security forces implicated in gross human rights abuses can be sanctioned under the Global Magnitsky Act, and that's also something that might get Bangladesh's attention. We can talk about that more in the Q&A. The point is, Congress can play a huge role on the Bangladesh situation by either imposing new provisions in law or urging the State Department to use existing authorities to either sanction or incentivize or disincentivize the Bangladesh government. And we really ought, the United States Congress really ought to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Waris?
Thank you to the Lantos Human Rights Commission, the staff, and all of you for taking time out of your very busy days to discuss the very important issue that we're talking about today, which is the elections and human rights and sort of the crux of those things happening in Bangladesh. With the country heading to the polls near the turn of the new year, it's important to reflect on past trends concerning the treatment of religious minority groups during election periods and also otherwise. But I think before doing so, I'm going to do something that usually doesn't happen at these kind of hearings, which is highlight some of the positives, right? To emphasize what's happening on the ground that we can really point to. So one thing that I'll say in terms of my job at the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, we care about religious freedom around the world, global trends in international religious freedom. And Bangladesh's accommodation of the Rohingya from Burma must be appreciated and applauded because other countries haven't stepped up the same way. So I think that there's something very important to discuss here, that the actions taken by the Bangladeshi government are important here because they've accommodated almost 1 million people who have crossed into their border, and they're trying to provide some kind of sort of refuge for them. I think the unsung heroes, by the way, in all this that I saw during my travels to Cox's Bazar, which is where the Rohingya refugees are the local Cox's Bazar citizens. These people have opened up their homes, their communities, they've risked a lot and had a personal loss in a lot of ways by accommodating the refugees, and they've done so. And that needs to be, I think, recognized and applauded. Now, to return to the domestic picture of religious freedom in Bangladesh, one of the overall trends that has to be first understood is that the population of minority religious groups, including Hindus, has been decreasing over time in the country. Many are leaving, others are sort of facing discrimination, and because of that social, economic, political discrimination, there's an exodus happening, especially within the Hindu community that's been happening for a few decades now, really. Specifically looking at elections, religious minorities across South Asia. And by the way, the confluence of attacks on religious minorities and elections is something that's very regional. It happens in Pakistan, it happens in Nepal, it happens in India, it happens in Sri Lanka. I could keep going in the list. So it's a regional sort of thing that's happening. And religious minorities across South Asia have been subject to intimidation, threats, and physical violence in the lead-up and the follow-up of elections. This did happen in Bangladesh to some extent in 2014, when Hindu, Buddhist, and Christian homes and shops were destroyed by opposition party supporters. This is perhaps why in 2018, I believe it was September or August, the Hindu, Bodha, Christian Oikya Parishad, or the HBCOP, which is a really cool organization that's sort of representatives from all of the various non-Muslim sort of minority religious groups work together, and they have this commission that works together, and through that commission, in 2018, they declared that each community was seeking additional protection from the police and assurances from political leaders that the communities wouldn't suffer attacks during the 2018 elections. Now, the HBCOP explained that overall attacks against the communities have been going down. In 2016, there were nearly 1,500 violent attacks against religious minorities. In 2017, 1,000. In 2018, up till August, 380. So the numbers are going down, and we are seeing that reported from the religious minority groups themselves, which is a positive sign. And it can somewhat be attributed to the counterterrorism operations that the Bangladeshi government and security services have been engaged in. But there are some challenges that the new government that's forming in early 2019 will need to address. In 2013, the Hasina government was able to stand against calls by Islamist pressure groups like Hifazat-e-Islam who were asking for a mandate of the death penalty for blasphemy charges. The government was able to repel that. They said, no, we're not going to add the death penalty for blasphemy charges. We're not changing that law. And that's important because much like in Pakistan, in many of these blasphemy cases, they can be used as a weapon against non-Muslim religious minorities and deprive them of life, liberty, and property. Refusing to mandate the death penalty for such cases was an important step taken by the Hasina government. But in a speech that decried religious extremism generally last month, I believe, the Prime Minister recently stated that anyone insulting Islam or its prophet will be punished according to the law. So again, this goes back to, if we look at other places in South Asia, how blasphemy laws have been used, again, to be weaponized against religious minorities, and the Prime Minister saying that anyone insulting Islam or the Prophet will be punished according to the law is somewhat, troublesome for people who are watching from the outside. Further, Hifazat-e-Islam, which is the pressure group that I was talking about, the Islamist pressure group, recently hosted a Thanksgiving event for the Prime Minister to honor her government's policy recognizing certain madrasa degrees as equivalent to master's degrees in non-religious universities and colleges. Some critics did see that the Prime Minister went to this Thanksgiving event with a group that's known to have sort of hardline Islamist views and saw that as a means of drumming up electoral support among religiously conservative sections of the population. As I mentioned, the elections are right around the corner, so going to an event that's a Thanksgiving event between this group and the Prime Minister might help sort of get some votes in the voter bank. Further, in the past years, Hifazat has demanded alterations to school curriculum, some of which were put in place by the Hasina administration eventually. Now, moving from these connections of these extremist Islamist groups with political parties, I think one major trend that impacts not only religious communities, but all citizens in Bangladesh is land scarcity. In a country that's the size of the state of Iowa, there's 160 million people. I'm going to say it one more time. In the size of the state of Iowa, that's the landmass we're talking about, there's 160 people. So land disputes have become major issues, especially in the Chittagong Hill Tracts area, where there's a lot of indigenous groups who live there and who are being attacked and their land is being taken. Non-Muslim groups have reported that their private property as well as religious property, and in Bangladesh there are actually trusts set up for each religious group to have protected property as a trust property for that religious group. Some of those lands are actually being encroached upon or completely stolen by people belonging to what they call land mafias or people with political connections. I think these issues will all probably continue to pose challenges to the new ruling regime that's going to come in power in early 2019, some of which are very structural and institutional and will require structural and institutional changes, which is I think some of what John was talking about, that the US Congress should be encouraging those institutional changes, and not to think sort of in the short term, but to think long term, because a lot of these problems that I've described have persisted in the long term. So we have to think of that way on the hillside. And then we'll have questions later on. That's all I have. Yeah.
Thank you, Waris. Laura?
Good afternoon, my name is Laura Bramon. I'm the Senior Program Manager for Child Protection and Education at World Vision. And I'd like to begin by thanking Congressman McGovern, Congressman Holtgren, members of the Commission, and all of you who have come out this afternoon. It's really an honor to be able to speak here more broadly on behalf of vulnerable children in Bangladesh. World Vision is a global Christian relief, development, and advocacy organization dedicated to working with children, families, and communities in over 100 countries. Some of our earliest work in Bangladesh served survivors of political violence during the country's liberation war of 1972. Recently, a considerable...
71.
Sorry, my apologies, 71. Recently, a considerable focus of our programming in Bangladesh has been with refugees from Myanmar that have fled to Bangladesh because of extreme violence in the northern Rakhine state. We're deeply concerned about the ongoing threat to repatriate these refugees. The involuntary return of refugees to Myanmar, where their lives and safety remain at grave risk, is a violation of fundamental refugee protection principles. In December, Bangladesh will hold its general elections, and political violence will still remain a grave cyclical danger for Bangladeshi children. In election seasons and on anniversaries of controversial political events, we see sexual violence and firebombing often claim children among their victims. We often see as well many of the political and pressure groups enlisting orphan and street children to commit violent crimes, sometimes while under the influence of, forcibly under the influence of drugs. But sadly, what happens during election seasons is part of a broader culture of violence that children face. It's estimated that 1.2 million Bangladeshi children are exploited in the worst forms of child labor. From my experience, which is generally focused in the Khulna region, it's not unusual for children to enter hazardous, forced, or bonded labor around the age of 8 or 9. Girls face the additional danger of child marriage,